There you go. Thank both of you for coming out for some keys. I ain't got the keys there any. Can I have an apple? Sure, help yourself. Got it. It was one of the most beloved shows in television history. A quiet little town called Mayberry. A calm, competent sheriff. And one hilariously nervous deputy who stole nearly every scene he was in. Don Knotts brought Barney Fife to life. In a way, no one else could, turning the jittery lawman into a television icon. But just as the show was hitting its stride, Don walked away. No farewell tour, no big send-off, just gone. Fans were stunned. Why would someone leave a role that made him a household name? What could possibly drive a man to step away from something so successful, so adored, and so seemingly perfect? At the time, the explanation seemed simple. Contracts ended, careers moved on, and that was that. But years later, as interviews resurfaced and private moments became public knowledge, a very different picture started to emerge. One that involved broken trust, missed chances, and a decision that left both Don and Andy with regrets. Was it really just about money and timing? Or was there something deeper beneath the surface? A quiet disappointment that neither man fully admitted while the cameras were rolling. Don Knotts did not just leave the Andy Griffith Show. He left behind something personal. And once you know the full story, it becomes clear. This was not just a career decision. It was a moment that would quietly reshape the show, the friendships behind it, and Don's life in ways no one saw coming. And it all started with a promise that was never kept. Before Don Knotts became America's favorite bumbling deputy, he was just a skinny, anxious kid from Morgantown, West Virginia. His childhood was far from easy. His father suffered from serious mental health issues, and Don often retreated into himself to avoid conflict. But even then, he had a talent for comedy. Making people laugh became his way of coping, and later, his path out. He honed his skills during World War II, entertaining troops overseas. After the war, he struggled to break into the business, bouncing between radio, theater, and small TV gigs. Nothing quite stuck until a stage production called No Time for Sergeants introduced him to a rising star named Andy Griffith. The chemistry between them was instant. When Andy landed his own show in 1960, Don reached out to ask if there might be room for him. Andy said yes, and just like that, the Andy Griffith Show found its heartbeat. Barney Fife was not meant to be a lead. He was supposed to appear now and then, a bit of comic relief. But the moment Don stepped into the role, something clicked. His jittery voice, his bug-eyed expressions, his unearned bravado. It was magic. Audiences could not get enough. He turned Barney into a TV icon, winning 5 Emmy Awards and helping define what made Mayberry feel real. Behind the scenes, Don and Andy shared a close friendship. There was trust, respect, and genuine warmth. It felt like lightning in a bottle. But even in those early days, Don was uneasy. Television was unpredictable, and he had lived through enough hardship to never fully trust that success would last. So when Andy told him the show would run just 5 years, Don took it to heart. He began quietly planning for the end. A future beyond Mayberry. And that future would come faster and more painfully than anyone expected. As the Andy Griffith Show soared in popularity, Don Knotts remained focused on what came next. From the start, Andy had told him that the show would only last 5 years. It was not just a casual comment. It was something Don believed. They were close friends, and Don trusted Andy's word. So as the 5th season approached, Don began thinking seriously about his future. He had spent years playing Barney Fife, winning awards and earning the admiration of millions. But if the show was ending, he needed to move on. That was the plan. Or at least, that was what he had been told. Hollywood was already knocking. Universal Pictures offered Don a 5-picture deal, something rare and lucrative for a television actor at the time. It was a chance to headline films, gain creative control, and try something new. Don hesitated, but ultimately he said yes. He signed the contract, trusting that his time in Mayberry was coming to an end. And then came the twist. Near the end of that 5th season, Andy changed his mind. The show would not end after all. Ratings were strong, the network wanted more, and Andy decided to keep it going. But Don had already signed. He was committed. He could not undo the deal, and Andy never asked him to try. Andy was blindsided. The promise had shifted, and no one had told him until it was too late. He later admitted in interviews that he felt hurt. Not out of anger, but disappointment. He had built his future around a plan that vanished without warning. Andy later expressed regret, admitting he should have handled things differently. He had not meant to mislead Don, but he also had not reached out when it mattered most. And that silence left a mark. Don did not fight it. He finished his final season with grace, collected his 5th Emmy, and said goodbye. Not because he wanted to leave, but because he thought he already had to. When Andy Griffith chose to continue the show beyond 5 seasons, it was not announced with fanfare or open discussion. It just happened. One moment, the cast expected to wrap things up. The next, it was business as usual. Except Don Knotts was no longer part of the plan. Andy had always been seen as steady, kind, and approachable. He ran the set like a family, supportive, light-hearted, filled with laughter. But when it came to this decision, something shifted. Andy had once told Don clearly that 5 years would be the end. Don had believed him. But as the show's ratings stayed high and the network pushed for more, Andy reconsidered quietly. By the time Don found out the show would continue, he had already committed to Universal Pictures. His movie deal was done. What hurt most was not just that the show was moving forward, but that no one had reached out to him. Andy never asked Don if there was a way to make it work. He never said, "Stay." In later interviews, Andy admitted he regretted it. He had not meant to leave Don out. He had just waited too long. He thought there would be time, but there wasn't. Don had moved on, and that chance to fix things had passed. Don never made a public fuss about it, but privately, those close to him said the decision hit hard. He had not wanted to leave Mayberry. He had only done so because he thought it was ending, and once he learned otherwise, the door was already closed. The show carried on, but something unspoken hung between the two men. They still respected each other. They still spoke. But the closeness, the easy rhythm they once had, it never fully returned. A single decision had changed everything, and all because one man thought he had time, and the other had already walked away. After leaving the Andy Griffith Show, Don Knotts stepped into the bright, uncertain world of Hollywood. With a multi-picture deal from Universal Pictures, he was suddenly a leading man. For a character actor known for playing neurotic sidekicks, it was a rare shot at full-fledged stardom. His first film under the deal, The Incredible Mr. Limpet, featured Don as a meek man who turns into a fish, equal parts absurd and charming. The movie performed well enough, and more roles followed. The Ghost and Mr. Chicken, The Reluctant Astronaut, The Shakiest Gun in the West. Each one featured Don doing what he did best, awkward, well-meaning characters stumbling into chaos. From the outside, he was thriving. His face was on posters. His movies drew crowds. The actors wanted more of him, but on the inside, Don felt something missing. These films were fun, but they lacked the emotional weight of Mayberry. There was no Andy, no familiar cast, no long-running chemistry that built something deeper than jokes. Don was not part of a family anymore. He was just a hired star, and over time he began to feel it. Though he appreciated the success, Don could not ignore the emptiness that followed. He felt colder. The roles felt repetitive. In truth, many of his film characters were just echoes of Barney Fife. Quirky, nervous, lovable, but without the same spark. He was still making people laugh, but it no longer felt personal. Don was not chasing fame. He was chasing purpose. And with each new film, he wondered if he had left something more valuable behind. Not just a great role, but a place where he belonged. Mayberry had given Don more than success. It had given him identity, connection, and joy. And now, no matter how big the paycheck or how bright the lights, he realized that something truly special had been left behind. Don Knotts had a face made for comedy. Wide-eyed, expressive, instantly lovable. But behind that famously nervous grin was a man who battled with something far less visible. Deep insecurity and crushing anxiety. Even during the height of his success, when audiences roared with laughter and studios courted him with movie deals, Don often felt alone, isolated, haunted by the fear that he was never quite good enough. Those who knew him best described two versions of Don. There was the energetic performer who could light up a room, and then there was the quiet, introspective man who wrestled with self-doubt when the cameras stopped rolling. Don had always been sensitive, painfully so, and the weight of public expectations began to wear on him. His life after the Andy Griffith Show looked glamorous on the surface, but the cracks were hard to ignore. Hollywood offered him fame, but not the warmth he had known in Mayberry. And as the years passed, he started to miss more than just the show. He missed the friendships, the routines, the feeling of being part of something bigger than himself. Most of all, he missed Andy. Their on-screen chemistry had been electric, but off-camera, their bond had been just as real. They had shared inside jokes, heartfelt talks, and a deep trust that was rare in the industry. And though Don never openly blamed Andy for how things had unfolded, there was a quiet sadness in how he spoke about their parting. He never said Andy had betrayed him, but he did say he wished things had gone differently. Rumors began to swirl in later years, whispers that Don had not truly wanted to leave the show, that if Andy had just picked up the phone and said, "Let us work this out," Don would have stayed. Not for the money, not for the fame, but for the bond they had built and the simple joy of making something beautiful together. Instead, Don carried on. He kept working. He stayed funny. But the sparkle in his eyes, the one that had been so alive during those early Mayberry days, dimmed just slightly. He did return to the Andy Griffith Show for a few guest appearances after his official departure. Fans were thrilled, and for a brief moment, it felt like old times. But something had changed. The rhythm was different. The closeness was not quite the same. They still made each other laugh, but now there was space between them, space that neither of them knew how to close. Don never spoke harshly of Andy in interviews. He always praised his talent, his generosity, and the show they created together. But in rare, more candid moments, he would hint at regrets. Not about leaving exactly, but about the way it had all happened, the timing, the silence, the opportunity that slipped away before either man realized how much it would mean. And as his film career continued, Don began to realize something else. He had never stopped being Barney Fife in the eyes of the world, but the place where Barney truly lived, he had already left behind. Years passed, but Don Knotts and Andy Griffith never disappeared from the public eye. Their legacies were already cemented. Yet, as time marched on, fans began to wonder, would the two ever reunite in a meaningful way? Could that old Mayberry magic ever return? The answer, for a time, was yes. Don made several guest appearances on the Andy Griffith Show after his official departure, stepping back into Barney's shoes with the same energy and comic brilliance as before. Those episodes were warmly received, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like the clock had turned back. Don and Andy still had their rhythm, still knew how to play off each other with effortless charm, but something was different. Even though the chemistry was there, the closeness was not. Those brief reunions were professional, not personal. They were performances, not repairs. The warmth was still present, but it had cooled. The connection, once so natural, now felt tentative. Andy would later reflect on this in interviews, speaking with a surprising amount of honesty. He called Don the funniest man he had ever known. He praised his timing, his commitment, and his generosity as a performer. But then, with a hint of remorse, he added that he had not handled Don's departure the way he should have. "I did not ask him to stay," Andy admitted. "And I should have." That single sentence said more than entire interviews ever could. Don, for his part, never went public with any grievances. He was not that kind of man. He spoke respectfully of Andy and of the show, but those who knew Don closely said the topic of Mayberry always brought a flicker of emotion. Not bitterness, but wistfulness. A soft ache for something lost. In one rare interview, Don spoke about his time on the show, saying, "It was the best job I ever had." And when asked if he would have stayed had things played out differently, he paused, then said, "Maybe. I loved it there." They would go on to work together again in the 1980s and 1990s, most notably on Matlock, where Don appeared in a recurring role. By then, the wounds had faded, but the scar remained. Their scenes together were often light and playful, but behind the laughter was a subtle sense of time passing, of chances missed. Neither man ever addressed the rift directly. They let the past lie where it fell, but for fans who watched closely, it was clear. Something had shifted that had never fully been put back in place. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones that never happen. And for Don and Andy, the real goodbye may not have been the one we saw on screen, but the quiet distance that lingered in the years that followed. When Don Knotts left the Andy Griffith Show, the entire dynamic of the series quietly changed. On paper, things looked fine. The show continued. New characters were introduced. Andy still held the spotlight, but the soul of the series, the nervous energy, the comic balance, the unpredictable charm that Barney Fife brought, was missing, and viewers felt it. Barney was not just comic relief. He was the emotional counterweight to Andy's calm wisdom. He was the over-eager sidekick who meant well, failed often, and always found his way back into our hearts. Without him, the world of Mayberry lost its tension. It became too smooth, too safe, and slowly the show's sparkle began to fade. Ratings declined after Don's exit, though the show remained popular. Critics noted that the humor felt softer, more restrained. The sharp, quick-witted edge that Don had mastered was gone. Even Andy himself later admitted that the show was never quite the same. He said that Don's absence left a big hole, and that no one else could have played that part. Not then, not ever. Barney Fife became something bigger than just a character. He was a symbol of television at its finest, a time when writing, acting, and heart came together in a way that felt almost magical. Don's performance earned him 5 Emmy Awards, but the true measure of his impact went beyond trophies. Generations of viewers still remember Barney's whistle, his wild-eyed speeches, his trembling attempts at authority. He was flawed, yes, but in the most lovable way. Don would go on to play other roles, but none would eclipse Barney Fife. And over time, he came to accept that, not with resentment, but with pride. He knew what he had created. He understood how rare it was to make something that truly lasts. In interviews later in life, Don spoke fondly of Mayberry. He never mocked it, never distanced himself from it. In fact, he often seemed grateful for it. He knew that no matter what else he did, people would always remember him as Barney. And slowly that became something he embraced fully. His legacy was not just in the laughter he brought, but in the emotional truth he gave to comedy. Barney was absurd, but never fake, over the top, but never hollow. He represented every person who ever tried too hard, cared too much, and still found a way to be loved for it. And for that, Don Knotts was not just a comedian. He was a television legend. Looking back, Don Knotts' decision to leave the Andy Griffith Show was not just a career move. It was a moment that redefined everything: his future, his relationships, and even his legacy. Most fans assumed he left for bigger opportunities, that he traded television for movies, sitcom comfort for cinematic ambition. And in a way, that was true, but that was only part of the story. The truth is, Don left because he thought he had to, because someone he trusted had told him the journey was ending, because he believed in the plan, and more importantly, he believed in the person who gave it to him. When that plan suddenly changed, Don was already too far down the road to turn back, and that decision haunted both men in different ways. For Andy Griffith, it was a misstep he openly admitted. He wished he had spoken up sooner, wished he had handled things differently. He knew what Don brought to the show, and what his absence took away. For Don, it was a lesson in timing, trust, and the fragility of even the closest friendships. They never stopped respecting each other, they never stopped caring. But the bond that had once been unshakable was forever altered by a moment of silence that lasted just a little too long. Yet despite the heartbreak, the regret, and the questions that would never be answered, Don never let bitterness take root. He carried himself with humility and grace, always aware of how lucky he had been to play a character that touched so many lives. He did not run from Barney Fife. He celebrated him. Even as he battled personal demons and navigated a shifting industry, Don never turned his back on the role that had made him a star. And in the end, that is what made him different. He was not chasing fame. He was chasing meaning. He wanted to make people laugh, not because it made him rich, but because it made him feel connected, seen, loved. Don Knotts left Mayberry, but Mayberry never left him. And maybe the real tragedy was not that he walked away, but that no one reached out to stop him. That behind all the laughter and success, two friends simply missed the moment to say what needed to be said. A small town, a quiet promise, and a man who gave us his best, then slipped out the back door, carrying a weight we never saw. That is why Don Knotts really left the Andy Griffith Show, and that is why we never forgot him.